Intelligent professionals lose control of high-stakes dialogues when they fail to recognize the structural manipulation baked into the questions they are asked. While most listeners focus on formulating the right answer, strategic communicators prioritize the architecture of the inquiry itself. In adversarial settings, a question functions less as a request for data and more as a cognitive boundary designed to narrow the respondent's range of thought. This is known as interrogative framing. By defining the terms of the inquiry, an interrogator forces you to adopt their specific premise simply to participate. This framework exploits the brain's tendency to choose the path of least resistance, triggering a state of reflexive compliance that overrides critical analysis. We can expose this mechanism by deconstructing 5 interrogative traps that target specific cognitive vulnerabilities. Neutralizing this influence requires decoupling a question's literal syntax from its underlying psychological motive. High-efficacy communicators apply this decoupling to identify the interrogator's intent before they consider the prompt's content. Effective defense begins with rejecting the premise of the question before an answer is ever generated. The question, "Who told you that?" is frequently used in adversarial environments to disrupt the delivery of evidence. This inquiry typically signals that the interrogator lacks the data necessary to challenge the core message. Unable to refute the facts, they pivot to attacking the messenger. Humans are susceptible to this because we rely on evolutionary shortcuts regarding tribal trust, often conflating the quality of information with the perceived status of its source. This is the genetic fallacy, attempting to invalidate data based entirely on its origin rather than empirical merit. This shifts the cognitive load of the debate. Your brain is forced away from analyzing objective truth to focus on the secondary task of defending source credibility. Defending a source on the spot induces a physiological stress response, which can cause you to lose your grip on the primary argument. Once the focus shifts from the data to the person, the manipulator has successfully regained control of the narrative. In high-conflict negotiations, the prompt, "Which side are you on?" is used to eliminate middle ground. The motive is to erase contextual nuance and force the respondent into an artificial, adversarial binary. Because complexity causes psychological discomfort, we are naturally inclined towards simple, opposing categories. While reality exists on a multivariable spectrum, this trap attempts to crush that data into 2 extreme, opposing boxes. This is the false dilemma, a cognitive constraint that presents only 2 options when many more are available. Engaging with the question as asked forces you into an extreme position that is difficult to logically defend. Analytical thinkers identify these artificial boundaries and reject them in real time. Refusing the binary is the only way to preserve a range of logical options and avoid being cornered by the interrogator's premise. "Don't you trust me?" is a tactic deployed in high-stakes relationships to bypass professional or personal verification protocols. The interrogator is attempting an affective override. They introduce emotional pressure to flood your logical processing and silence your critical thinking. This triggers the affective heuristic, where immediate emotions dictate your decision-making, overriding empirical logic. The question is built on the false premise that trust and verification are mutually exclusive. By using emotional guilt, the interrogator equates a standard request for data with a personal betrayal. Empirical verification actually serves to substantiate trust rather than negating it. Abandoning independent judgment because a request is framed emotionally leaves you vulnerable to unverified claims. When you yield to this pressure, you grant the interrogator compliance without requiring the evidence necessary for an objective evaluation. "What would you do if you were me?" is a request for empathy that masks a more strategic motive. It shifts the burden of accountability and the risk of the decision onto you. This relies on the illusion of perfect empathy, ignoring the fact that no 2 individuals possess the same cognitive history or neural pathways. You cannot accurately simulate another person's experiential or emotional data. The rational response is to act as a mirror, helping the other party find their own clarity rather than assuming responsibility for their actions. A similar dynamic exists in the question, "What's your biggest weakness?" which is often used to probe for exploitable vulnerabilities. The interrogator is looking for intelligence they can use later, disguised as a test of self-awareness. Answering this honestly creates a power imbalance. You provide the interrogator with leverage while receiving no useful information in return. This asymmetrical information allows a manipulator to target your specific insecurities in future interactions. When you recognize that personal details are being mined for future leverage, withholding them becomes a strategic defense. In this context, selective disclosure is a tool of social intelligence, a way to navigate hostile environments without providing the means for your own exploitation. Regulating the flow of personal data prevents conversational counterparts from weaponizing your internal state. Although these 5 questions appear in different contexts, they all rely on a predatory structural architecture. They weaponize the genetic fallacy, the false dilemma, the affective heuristic, limits in our theory of mind, and information asymmetry. Identifying this architecture allows you to recognize the constraints of a conversation before you are trapped by them. This architecture is countered by epistemic vigilance. This involves the real-time monitoring of a communicator's structural intent, rather than just their vocabulary. By inserting an analytical pause, you can evaluate the motive behind the prompt before generating a response. Strategic communication is the act of managing the conversational frame, rather than merely providing answers. Conversational intelligence involves diagnosing the structural intent of an inquiry and rejecting manipulative premises. This allows the respondent to dictate the terms of the engagement and maintain the integrity of their position within the dialogue.